It's a great honor to be joined by Dr. Nicholas Christakis. He's trained as both a medical doctor and a sociologist, and he's currently Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University, where much of his research has focused on social network analysis and the social contagion of health-related phenomena. He's also the best-selling author of 6 books, including Apollo's Arrow, The Profound and Enduring Impact of Coronavirus on the Way We Live. Nicholas, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Adam, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for taking the time. So let's talk a bit about your background, medical doctor, and then turned sociologist, turned network scientist.
Well, that's a very broad question. I don't know how to start it except to say that my mother was seriously ill when I was a boy. She was diagnosed when I was 6 with a kind of cancer that's now is very treatable. She had a very advanced Hodgkin's disease, but in 1968 it was not so treatable. And all 3 of my mother's sons became doctors. You know,
Uh-huh.
she died unfortunately when she was young, when she was 47 and I was 25. But my whole childhood was spent, with a seriously ill parent, which,
Mhm.
shapes you in a very dramatic way, shaped all of me and my siblings. And so I wanted to be a doctor. When I went to medical school, actually, when I got to college, I wanted to study linguistics. I was actually very interested in semiotics, in the study of symbols and or symbolism. And but I was afraid to do that. I didn't have enough courage. And so, excuse me one second. Let me. When I got to college, I wanted to study linguistics or actually semiotics, but I was afraid to do that. So because I wanted to go to medical school, I thought maybe that wouldn't be reasonable. So instead, I switched timidly to biology, and then I went to medical school. I went to Harvard Medical School and started there in 1984. And when I got there, I wanted to be a reconstructive surgeon and reattach severed extremities. But that desire didn't last long either because I very rapidly figured out that surgery was not for me, although my older brother became a surgeon. And I decided that I would do internal medicine instead. And that was finally when my mother began to die, and I wanted to be able to take care of her. I had grown up in Washington, D.C., and it wasn't really easy to be a medical student and provide care for a parent or a sick relative. So I decided to take a year off from medical school and get a master's in public health degree, which Harvard generously allowed. And because taking classes, on the wards, you have very little freedom. I mean, you can't, you have to do what you're told. But if you're taking classes, you could skip class for a week. It's not the end of the world. So I did that, and I was commuting to Washington, D.C. from Boston to help care for my mother. And it was during that year of my life, she died, but it was also during that year of my life that I kind of rediscovered the social sciences. And I had always wanted to be an academic, being a professor. I wanted to do research. I wanted to teach. And so then I began to think about, well, how would I do that? And even already in the 80s, in the 50s, it was sort of the heyday of clinical medicine, and you could run a laboratory just with MD training. But already by the 80s, when I was in school, that was no longer possible. You needed to get doctoral training to run a lab. And so I was trying to figure out what to get a PhD in. And then again, for mostly serendipitous reasons, I picked sociology, which is not a very high status social science, but it's nevertheless a very old and interesting social science. I went to the University of Pennsylvania to get my PhD. And I finally, in 1995, at the age of 33, finished my education or my formal education.
Yeah.
Of course, I've continued to educate myself for decades since then. But anyway,
Mhm.
so that's, I guess isn't that what you asked? My educational
Yeah. Do
background?
you do you think your medical and biological background ended up shaping the type of sociology research you were doing?
Oh, for sure. I mean, they both. I mean, the thing is, I have a very kind of conflicted attitude towards my medical training. On the one hand, the great majority of the work I do first of all of it is health and biologically inflected. I study behavior genetics. I study the sociology of health. I study the social origins of illness. I study the social determinants of health. Those have been the themes, broadly speaking, of my career. I study epidemiology, and epidemics are jointly biological and social phenomena. So there's no doubt that both trainings have helped, but I have different attitudes towards each. So, for example, I feel blessed that in retrospect, that I did sociology, because social network analysis began in the field of sociology with Simmel in the 1890s. And most of the deepest work was done by sociologists, actually, who were struggling with understanding the structure of human social interactions. And a lot of the methods that were invented by sociologists, for example, to study who is central in a social network and how do we quantify that. Of course, they were borrowing ideas from mathematicians, these crazy Hungarian mathematicians and others, and they invented all these methods, which actually those methods were then taken up by neuroscientists who were trying to study neural networks, by geneticists who were studying genetic networks, by computer scientists who were studying computer networks. A lot of the deep mathematics and phenomenology of networks was done actually by sociologists, which is great. And I was exposed to that in the early 1990s when I was getting my PhD. And of course, that changed my career. I mean, it reshaped my trajectory and equipped me to pounce in the late 1990s when I saw some opportunities to study networks. And that's what I've spent my life studying. But medicine, I mean, I have a very conflicted attitude towards medicine, because on the one hand, I'm proud to be a doctor. I found it morally fulfilling. I feel good about myself. I had precious experiences not available to other human beings. I personally have saved people's lives. Like, I know, but for me, they would be dead. And that's an extraordinary experience to have had. Some ordinary citizens have that experience, because they pull someone from a burning car. 1 in 10,000 human beings has that opportunity. And of course, there are people in the, in the firemen and policemen and police officers and so on who have those opportunities. So I had that opportunity, which was extraordinary. And then I had other opportunities because of my training in medicine. Like, I was a hospice doctor. I took care of people who were dying. And so I was present when hundreds of people have died. Like, I've held the hands of hundreds of people when they were dying. And it's a very intimate and special opportunity that's not granted to many. And so I have it was morally fulfilling. It provided certain deep life experiences. That the fund of knowledge is valuable, like learning medicine and pharmacology and physiology and anatomy. And those are valuable pieces of things to know. But it consumes 7 years of my life, 4 years of medical school and 3 years of residency. Depends on how you count the fellowship as well. That's another year or two. In my 20s, and so it was a major commitment, crucial years of my life. So my career has unfolded as it's unfolded, but it's just been interesting now, and I'm almost 60, I'm 59, to look back and think about some of the decisions I made in my 20s and, the long reach of those decisions.
So it'd be very interesting to unpack this network analysis research you do, because we tend to think of health either on the very individual level, like you were just describing, or maybe on a massive societal level, like social determinants of health. But that tends to look at populations. But network analysis, you're looking at little clusters of people, and it doesn't seem like, at least I hadn't heard much of it before coming across your work.
Well, it's interesting you frame it that way, because I have framed it that way too. Maybe you've seen some of this, I don't know, or maybe independently you're looking at it that way. I think you can think of the social sciences as having gone through sort of a series of phases. So you had the kind of Adam Smith understanding of the origins of social order, trying to provide an account for the emergence of markets, for example. And Smith says, each individual acting on their own as if guided by an invisible hand, winds up producing this emergent property known as a market, this supra-individual phenomenon, the markets. And it was very much a kind of reductionistic approach that took social phenomena and reduced them to the actions of individual agents. And then, in the sort of 19th century, you have thinkers like Marx and Durkheim and others who say, look, actually we can dispense with individuals. We can just speak of collectivities of individuals. Marx speaks about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and Durkheim speaks about, French Catholics and French Protestants, across time. And in his work on suicide, he says, look, the suicide rate of these groups is the same for 100 years, even though the individuals come and go. What's going on there? There's something super individual. And these thinkers sort of say you can ignore individuals and just study collectivities, populations, groups of people defined by some attribute, their religion, their class, their race, whatever. And that offers some advantages and is an interesting set of ideas. But I think what network science does is it offers us a set of ideas and tools to move between those, to understand how do individuals, how do they come to have collective identity? How do you get emergent properties? And the analogy that I used for this to illustrate this idea, which will be familiar, I'm sure, to many listeners, if they took high school chemistry, which was, in high school chemistry, you studied the allotropes of carbon. For example, you learn that graphite and diamond are both made of carbon. And the difference is that in graphite, the carbon atoms are arranged one way, and you get graphite, which is soft and dark, or you take the same carbon atoms and arrange them another way, and then you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key intellectual ideas there. First, that these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms, they're properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Connect them one way, you get one set of properties. Take the same carbon atoms and connect them another way, you get a different set of properties. And it's the same with human groups. You can take a group of people and you connect them one way, they have a high suicide rate, connect them another way, they have a low suicide rate, for instance. And we've done lots and lots of experiments now in my lab over the years studying this. These emergent properties, softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are emergent properties of carbon. Consciousness is an emergent property of neuronal tissue. You take neurons in a petri dish and they're isolated from each other. You assemble them into a brain in a living thing like us, and you get consciousness. Well, where is the consciousness? It's from the connection of the parts. It's not in the parts. So network science gives us a way, you see, to understand how the whole comes to be greater than the sum of its parts, and straddles these two individualistic and collectivistic perceptions on social order that I mentioned earlier. So yes, I think networks are an effective way of bridging these systems, and provides both tools and ideas to understand that.
Mm-hmm. Those are good examples. So how does it relate to health exactly? Is it like if someone has a bad habit or a good habit, they might start copying their friends, and then their friends copy their friends, and so on?
Well, there are many ways. Conceptually, the way I think about this is that there are three ways in which network structure might play a role in all kinds of outcomes, including health outcomes: connection, contagion, and position. Let me see if I can illustrate this. Connection is the idea that the wiring diagram between individuals might play a role in the properties of the individuals and of the group. A very simple example of this might be Alcoholics Anonymous. You take a group of individuals who were previously strangers to each other, you foster connections between them, and now you can foster abstinence, right? You can kind of create a new property in the collectivity of individuals and within the individuals that wasn't necessarily present before. Or you take a group of military recruits, you put them through basic training, you force them into a little platoon, you say you're going to sink or swim together, and you take a group of strangers who previously were indifferent to each other's fate, and now you cultivate in them a willingness to die for each other. was quite an extraordinary thing. And it has to do with the structure of the connections. And we've done many experiments in my lab to show, for instance, that I can take a group of people and I connect them one way and they're very cooperative, they're very nice to each other. Or I take the same people and connect them a different way under a different set of rules, like the carbon example. And those people are mean sons of bitches to each other. They're not nice to each other at all anymore. Same people, but by manipulating the wiring diagram between them, I can foster these emergent properties, let's say, of cooperation and many other properties. So that's connection. Contagion is the idea that the wiring diagram is, let's say, fixed and perhaps immutable. People are connected, they have their own friends and spouses and whoever they have. But now the question is, who should you target, let's say, for an intervention such that you optimize the spread of something within the network? For example, if you're a bioterrorist, who should you infect with germ so that everyone in the city would die, right? You would not infect the hermit, who had no social interactions. That would be a waste of your effort. You would have the intuition that you want to infect someone very popular with many connections, for example. Well, that is a contagion intervention. And we've done many experiments with this in the lab too, where we've shown, for instance, that we can go into villages in Honduras or into poor parts of Mumbai in India, and by thoughtfully choosing who we educate about a public health intervention, create artificial tipping points where we sort of magnify, create these cascade effects, foster these cascade effects, where we can foster these spreading processes in the network. Those are contagion. And the third thing, which is more subtle, we call position. And this relates to some of our work with artificial intelligence and what we call hybrid systems of humans and machines. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Position interventions are when the wiring diagram is specified and the set of individuals that you have to play with is specified, but you can pick where to put individuals in the diagram. So for example, think about a classroom teacher where all the desks are nailed to the floor. You have 20 desks, and outside the classroom, you've got 20 students of, let's say, differing abilities. Some are smart, some are not so smart. Where should you seat the kids so as to optimize learning in the classroom? Should you put the smart kids in the front, in the back? Should you alternate them? How should you arrange the people in the classroom to get the most learning in the classroom? Those are position interventions. So the network is fixed. You're not manipulating contagion. You're just manipulating the organization of the individuals within the graph, within the social graph. So we've done experiments with that too, where we have experimentally manipulated where we add bots, forms of artificial intelligence, into social systems, creating what we call hybrid systems of humans and machines. So let's say 90% of the nodes in the network are real humans and 5 or 10% are bots, forms of AI. Where should you put the bots? And also secondarily, how should you program the bots, which is another whole question, such that the bots help the humans to help themselves, so that you optimize the emergence of desirable properties like cooperation or innovation or whatever. Anyway, so those are some of the ways of thinking about this. And needless to say, I'm being very professorial. You're like, you're asking me about, you're asking me about stuff that's, over home plate for me. So.
Yeah, this is a great overview. So I'm thinking again about the last one and about the example of kids in a classroom, and you're going to have different forms of optimization. Because on one hand, you could imagine if you put all the smart kids together, they're going to learn the most. But as a consequence of that, you're also putting all the troublemakers together, and they're going to cause more trouble. But then if you mix them all together, maybe the smart kids won't learn as much, but the troublemakers won't cause as much trouble. So how do you define what is optimal there? And is there a technical term for that?
Well, no, it depends. And actually, that particular example is an artificial example, just to illustrate the point. But other scientists have done this experiment. And at the Air Force Academy, there were some randomized controlled trials of previously at the Air Force Academy, students were randomly assigned to platoons and 10 people, and they sank or swam on their own. This group, you were put in with these 10 guys, men and women, and this was your team, and you just had to get along with them and work with them and so on. And then the question became, well, what if we kind of manipulated how we did that? Could we improve learning for everyone, for instance? And the cadets are evaluated based on their fitness, their leadership, and their academic performance. And to make a long story short, the experiment was a failure. They tried to improve random assignment, but they weren't able to. Things got worse, partly because of what you suggested, which is any benefits accruing to certain people were countermanded by the deficits accruing to others. Now that doesn't call into question the whole position idea. We've done experiments where position can be manipulated for better. But on the classroom example, I was just responding narrowly to the classroom example.
Right. That makes sense. So in your book, Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, well, we talk about how these networks effects are very dependent on environment and who's in the network. But then at the same time, over evolutionary spans of time, I'm guessing we're converging towards certain behaviors that might be more cooperative or beneficial to survival. So how does that work, looking at it from a network science perspective?
Well, that's again a long, long question.
Yeah.
So there, the idea there is that, that first of all, we humans evolved to live socially, and that our genes play a role not just in the structure and function of our bodies, and not just in the structure and function of our minds, but also in the structure and function of our societies.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I make an argument that the benefits of a connected life must have outweighed the costs. Yes, right. It's true that by living together, we expose ourselves to all kinds of hazards. You could lie to me, or take my things, or torture me, or kill me, and therefore I'd have been better off not being near you. But equally, you also offer me benefits. We can work together to achieve objectives. You can teach me things. We can love and befriend each other and cooperate with each other and teach each other things, and that these are wonderful qualities. And I generally argue that that scientists and people on the street have tended to ignore the positive aspects of human sociality in favor of the negative aspects, but actually that's an incomplete story. And if anything, the forces for good, evolutionarily speaking, have been more powerful than the forces for evil. So Blueprint is an exploration of how evolution has shaped us to be good, and what qualities it has endowed us with that one might reasonably call good qualities, like love and friendship and cooperation and teaching and so on, and how evolution might have shaped us for that. Now, once you get that far, there's another step, which I think finally now answers your question, which is the following idea, which is that we humans have within us the capacity to create a society. But when we create a society, we modify our environment, and that environment now functions as part of the Darwinian fitness landscape and imposes a selection pressure on us, which reshapes our propensity to make our environment. Let me give an example. Let me illustrate this idea with a simpler example, which is beaver dams. So a beaver has genes that specify the shape of the beaver's teeth and the shape of the beaver's, flat tail. That's obvious. And the beaver also has genes that shape the beaver's innate behavior. Like, for example, it builds dams, beaver dams. Beavers build dams. They aren't taught to do that. They just build dams. And now when they build a dam, the beaver reshapes its natural environment. By building a dam, it dams a little stream, and it creates a larger foraging area for the beaver to be able to forage in. And of course, it imposes selection pressure on other animals. For example, the kind of fish or snails that could survive have been changed because the beaver has created little ponds in the forest where there were none before. So that's pretty obvious from the point of view of the snail or the fish. Their environment has changed, so they can evolve to respond to this change in the environment. And it just so happens the beaver was the agent that changed the environment. But from the snail or the fish's point of view, who cares? Now, the interesting thing is, the beaver is also changed. So beavers, for example, now with bigger lungs that can stay underwater longer, can fare better when they build bigger dams that make a deeper pond that's wider, that has more of a perimeter. So the beaver has a behavior which reshapes its environment, building dams, which then acts as a selection pressure on other parts of the beaver's body, for example, its lungs. And so the beaver is not only imposing a selection pressure on fish and snails, the beaver is imposing a selection pressure on itself because of genes that specify something the beaver does outside its body. The dam is a physical object that the beaver is destined to make because of its genes. Just like the beaver has a tail that's attached to its body, the genes can specify this dam that are outside its body. Mm-hmm. Well, the same applies to humans. We are programmed to make these social networks, to knit together these social connections around us. We make something that surrounds us like a beaver dam. And now that thing that surrounds us is part of our evolutionary environment and feeds back on our propensity to make that thing, let's say, to make more friends, or the kinds of friends we make, or how we introduce our friends to each other. And what's amazing is that other mammals, other social mammals like elephants, with whom we share a last common ancestor 90 million years ago, have by independent, convergent evolution done the same thing. So elephants make social networks with mathematical structures almost indistinguishable from ours, and came to do this independently. Elephants also have names for each other. They can identify each other. They have friends. They form long-term, non-reproductive unions with unrelated individuals, i.e. they have friends. Mm-hmm. And they evolve these capacities independently. And I think what happens is you get this feedback loop where you're led on a breakneck pace to a particular sort of destination, as it were. Destination is not the right word in evolution, but anyway. Mm-hmm. And you make these societies with particular features, elephant society and human society. Anyway, that's a long preamble and a long way of answering your question, which is how we can reshape our environment and how that feeds back upon ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So it's never stable. So it's like, maybe we can go back to the beaver example in this case. So if for whatever reason your ability to make a bigger dam was inversely related to the size of your lungs, it seems like those two would sort of cancel out. But then if it's not canceled out, you might just have this constant push-pull. And is that what happens with the networks we create?
I think you can reach an evolutionary equilibrium, but I would agree with you that it's not over. I mean, I'm not saying that evolution has a teleology. I mean, I don't preclude that beavers could, over the next 10 million years, evolve in some other unforeseen ways. And who knows, maybe the beavers of the future will not be making dams or evolve in some, whatever serendipitous direction they evolve. But right now, it's in a sense, it's an optimal solution for the environmental challenge faced by the beavers. In our case, you could imagine a kind of warming planet that plays some kind of role in what kind of social order is optimal for us. And I think we would evolve to ultimately make a social order that is, suited to whatever new environment we might face in the future.
Mm-hmm. So would it be right to think of it that we evolve the capacity both for like whatever different behaviors we might have depending on our differing place in the network, and then it's just that the actual place in the network we are will bring it out in us? Maybe we should have a concrete example to make sense of that.
I'm not sure I'm following your point. I mean,
let's say you mentioned suicide rates earlier. So let's say you have a fixed rate of depression in a population, and for the most part, suicide rate stays low. But if the network was rearranged such that all the depressed people were put together, maybe the suicide rate would go up in that group. So it seems like we evolved something about our tendency or our capacity for suicide is brought out depending on our environment. So is it like they're both sort of lying there dormant, and it's just that our environment ends up bringing out the final behavior?
I'm not sure I've understood your question, but if it relates to this issue of gene by environment interactions, maybe. I mean, we definitely have proclivities of all kinds. For example, one example we have studied is the allelic variants that predispose you to obesity. Mm-hmm. The variants have existed for a long time, but until food was plentiful, they weren't expressed. In other words, if I studied human beings 100 or 1,000 years ago, and some had this variant that was prone to make them obese, and some had this variant that was not prone to make them obese in the FTO gene, but nobody had any food, I'd be unable to see any impact. I'd be unable to see the impact of the variant because everyone would be starving. It's only in an environment with plentiful food that suddenly we can see the expression of this mapping of genotypes to phenotypes, which is conditional on the environment that they're exposed to. So
yeah, that's a great example. So it's something that could lie dormant and then only later be brought out by a new environment.
Yes. And Adam, this is what I do: is I give example. That's my profession. I'm a professor. I come up with examples of things.
Yeah, you're doing a great job at it. It's making it much easier for me to follow. I appreciate it. Okay, so this would be a good point to shift towards talking about Apollo's arrow and COVID. Maybe we'll start with an easy question. The name Apollo's arrow, is there a story behind that?
I mean, absolutely. It's like one of the big ideas, or one of the kind of overarching themes in the book about the pandemic, was that this way we've come to live right now during this once in a century event feels very alien and unnatural to us. But actually, it's neither of those things. Plagues have been a part of the human experience. They're in the Bible. They're in the Iliad, in the oldest work of the Western canon that we have, begins with a plague. They're in Shakespeare, they're in Cervantes. So the idea is that plagues are not new to our species. They're just new to us. We think this is crazy what's happening to us, but our ancestors tried to warn us. It's in our religious traditions, it's in our literary traditions, it's in our scientific tradition too, by the way. We have expert epidemiologists and medical historians who are expert in plagues. And so we had the knowledge in our society. It's just that most of us hadn't experienced a plague before. So we discounted it, A lot of my Jewish friends during the spring of 2020, during Passover, said, my whole life I had, did the Passover Seder and talked about plagues, but I never really gave it any thought, until now I was, actually experiencing it myself. So the story of the Iliad begins with a plague. So the Iliad is telling the story of the Greek siege of Troy during the Bronze Age civilization in Greece. These are stories based on historical events. I actually just visited Mycena, the capital of Mycenaean Greece, where Agamemnon was the king for the first time in my life this past summer. It was unbelievably moving. And the classical Greeks told stories about the Bronze Age Greeks, who they saw as like heroes, these ancient civilization. So the Mycenaean civilization was sort of on a par with Minoan civilization. We actually have Hittite records, written records, where the Hittites talk about a great king to their west called Atreus, who was, of course, we have written records about Atreus from their historical documents, which triangulate with the Homeric myths, and stories, because Atreus, of course, was the father of Agamemnon. Anyway, Agamemnon is the great king of the Greeks. The Greeks are laying siege to Troy in Asia Minor, and they are periodically going on excursions to sack vassal states of Troy. And on one of these excursions, they sack a city, they kill all the men, standard procedure, and they kidnap all the women and enslave them and bring them back to their camp, along with all the treasure from the sacked city. And one of these enslaved young women was a maiden by the name of Chryseis, who was the daughter of a priest of Apollo called Chryses. And Agamemnon brings her back. She's assigned to him as booty for the sacking. So she's now a slave in his household. And her father, who survived the massacre, comes to ransom his daughter. He comes, the story goes, comes to the Greek encampment, bringing a great ransom to ransom his daughter. And he beaches his ship and he walks through the encampment and he goes to the central tent of the great king Agamemnon, the primum inter pares of the Greeks, and falls on his knees and he begs Agamemnon to release his daughter from bondage. And he offers this ransom. And Agamemnon refuses. And he says, he smacks the man. And he also abuses him, and the Greek soldiers are very disturbed by this. They say, "Free the girl, return her to her father." But he won't do that, and he tells the man, "Your daughter will grow old in my house, at my loom, working in my bed." He's really brutal. And he says, and don't let me find you lurking around the ships, hoping to catch a view of her, or I'll kill you. So the father, weeping, goes back to just listen to this story. It's just an incredible story from thousands of years ago. You can see it, right? You can see every part of this story, how human it is. The father goes back to the shore and he prays. He says to Apollo, if I ever gave you offerings that pleased you in the past, dear God, hear me now and punish the Greeks. So Apollo instantly hears the priest's prayer up on Mount Olympus. And many ancient religions, polytheistic religions, but even monotheistic religions, the same God that caused health also caused illness. And Apollo was the god of health and of illness. And many ancient religions imagined plagues as being the results of a bowman deity, a deity that would release invisible arrows to drop you dead, with an unseen infection, we now know.
Wow.
So Apollo hears the prayer, takes his great silver bow, flies from Olympus, and lands among the Greek ships and crouches. And the poem goes, first he killed the running dogs, then the horses, then the men. 9 days through the army go the arrows of the god, and the funeral pyres burnt night and day, until on the 10th day, Hera, the queen of the gods, took pity on the Greeks, for she saw them perishing. And that's the beginning. That is the beginning of the Iliad. Okay, that's the story of a plague. And what amazed me is this past summer of 2021, when the epidemic swept through India, we yet again saw accounts that the epidemic, the force of mortality was so high that they ran out of oxygen and they ran out of supplies. The bodies were being burnt night and day, and they began to run out of wood because the funeral pyres were burning night and day, the same as in the Iliad. Or in New York City in March of 2020, it wasn't wood that we were running out of, it was refrigerator trucks. So many bodies were piling up, we didn't have enough ice to freeze the bodies. You see, these are deep and fundamental human experiences, very traumatic to our ancestors, so traumatic, so dramatic and traumatic that they were reduced to writing because they tried to warn us. This thing happens, you should know about it. And yet, we didn't pay attention when it was bearing down on us.
Wow.
Anyway, that's again a long answer.
So we've had plagues like these throughout history then. What about prehistory, before we started gathering in large cities? Like if you're a tiny little tribe, if a plague hits you, maybe it hits your tribe, but it doesn't seem like it's nearly the same scale.
Fantastic question. I think surely these types of epidemics are a product of the agricultural revolution, for the domestication of animals and the invention of cities. So first, 10 to 12,000 years ago, we domesticate animals, and then 8 to 10,000 years ago, we invent cities. And both of those, I think, were predicates for the emergence of some of the great epidemic diseases that have afflicted human beings for thousands of years. I think prior to that, we often did not have the population density and size to sustain these kinds of epidemics, just again for the intuitive reason you described. So, if a human came into contact with a wild animal and got some kind of disease, this is called the zoonosis, the group size was 30. We've studied this, actually. We've studied this in amongst the Hadza, who are one of the last remaining hunter-gatherers on the planet. We've mapped their networks. Only about 1,000 of them left. They have no material possessions to speak of. They sleep out under the stars. They hunt and they gather for their food. They live in small nomadic groups, which the membership of the groups fluctuates. People join, fission and fusion dynamics for these groups, but nevertheless, as you say, they're small and not sufficiently dense or large enough, I think, to sustain epidemics.
That makes sense. So then, going back to the network science idea, it seems like the larger a population you have, and especially the larger a population you have that can be transmitted across, like even if regardless of the population size, now we can travel across the world in like less than a day via plane. So you have the capacity to create a global pandemic, and I'm guessing that's exactly what happened.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think we had global pandemics in the 14th century with bubonic plague, when people were walking and taking boats and riding horses. And, the plague, we think, began in the Russian steppes and spread to Europe and then was in Europe for hundreds of years. Um, And during the 1890s, we had the so-called Russian flu, which spread from Moscow to New York, I think, in 75 days using rail lines and steamboats.
Wow.
Not dissimilar. We had the great smallpox plagues of the New World brought by the Europeans that decimated the Native American population, and this was before modern transport. So no, I think these plagues had the capacity to spread widely. It was a slower process. I will agree with you there. But I don't think there was a dichotomous before air travel and after air travel kind of situation.
Mm-hmm.
But we can use information about the flows of population using modern transport to forecast the course of the epidemic. And my laboratory has done some work like this too, where we've studied the movement of people. For example, in the case of COVID, we studied the movement of 11 million people through Wuhan in January of 2020 and how that was associated with the timing and intensity and location of the epidemic in China through the end of February. This paper was published in Nature in April of 2020. So yes, I mean, these transport links are important, but I don't think they change the character of the problem we're facing.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So you wrote this book pretty early on in November 2020, is that correct?
It was published in October of 2020. I started writing it in March of 2020. There's sort of serendipitous reasons why I did that. And I delivered it to the publisher. I had to write it fast. I delivered it to the publisher 4 months later in July of 2020. And then it was edited and manufactured, and it was on sale by middle of October of 2020.
So now, more than a year later, how much of what you wrote can you see is like stayed the same, and how much is new and unexpected? I mean, we had the Delta variant, for example, that might have been unexpected.
Well, I get asked this question a lot, and the paperback of the book just came out with a new preface and afterword in October of 2021. That just came out, and I kind of updated some things. But I get asked that question a lot, and it's very difficult to answer the question without it coming across as smug or self-satisfied, because honestly, very little has changed. I mean, and partly that's because these epidemics are so predictable. I mean, they follow, anyone who's studied pandemic disease or respiratory pandemics, we have a lot of data on what respiratory pandemics do. And many of the things that we've seen with this pandemic have been features. For example, the social responses to the pandemic, the grief, the fear, the denial. President Trump, denying that anything was happening. Many governors denying it. The lies, the blame, blaming others. During the bubonic plague, Jews were blamed. During HIV, homosexuals were blamed, or Haitians were blamed, or drug users were blamed. During COVID, Asians were blamed, or migrants were blamed. This idea that we blame someone else during times of plague. All of these feature, the grief, the fear, the lies, the denial, the blame, all of this stuff. The death of healthcare workers, Thucydides in the Plague of Athens, 240 BC or whatever it was, talks about how all the doctors were dying. Pope Clement VI during the 14th century talks about how all the nurses are dying. The death of healthcare workers, which we saw in 2020, also is an ancient phenomenon. Pretty much every social aspect of this plague, the economic collapse during the plague of Justinian, people wrongly think that it's our response, what we did, what the government did, collapse the economy. This is wrong. It's the virus that collapsed the economy. During the plague of Justinian, John of Ephesus, which is 1,500 years ago, the plague of Justinian, John of Ephesus, a historian and priest, talks about how everything stopped and ceased. The economy collapses. But there was no state ordering businesses to close or schools to close. It collapsed because there was an epidemic. And so all of these social features you see are fundamental features of plagues, and pretty much nothing has been surprising. The virological specifics do vary coronaviruses are different than influenza viruses. Respiratory pandemics are different than smallpox or measles pandemics or bubonic plague. Viral pandemics are different than bacterial pandemics. Pandemics that only kill, as this one does, in some sense, this is a pandemic light that we had because it only kills about 1% of the people. Whereas like Ebola and bubonic plague and cholera and smallpox, kill 30, 50, 70% of the people. So we had a light plague to deal with. So that matters too. But generally speaking, it's been pretty stereotypic, I would say.
Yeah. So having a light plague, as you said, do you think we're better prepared for a worse one if that were to come about? Do you think we learned our lesson?
If it comes within 30 years, if it happens, between your age and my age to you again, I think you'll take it seriously. But your children, when you're my age, probably be just caught as just as flat-footed.
Right. So people who live through it will take it more seriously, and then, but if we go a whole generation without ever living through it again, then the next generation might be unprepared.
I think so. Yes, and I think some things have changed. For example, I think the mRNA vaccine technology and the adenovirus technology are game changing, and I rarely say that about medicine. Like penicillin was game changing, and CAT scanning was game changing. There are not too many game changing things in medicine. Insulin was game changing, and I think this mRNA technology was game changing. I think it'll give us the tools for the next serious epidemic to rapidly be able to develop vaccines, super rapidly, to change the course of the epidemic while it's striking us, which is a historical first, basically. So yes, I think these things will make it easier for our descendants, thank goodness. Even if they don't heed our warning, in other words, they will at least have tools to cope with it more rapidly on their own.
That's very good to know. Nicholas, thank you so much for your time.
Adam, thank you so much for having me. This has been a very breakneck and, I don't know, I've enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for having me on the program, and good luck with what you're doing.
Thank you. It's great hearing about your work.